Now, listen, Charlie, let's talk about Sheffield Wednesday, who are coincidentally the Baggies' next opponents next weekend because Chansiri has gone. They're now in administration, and you've got a lot of experience turning round troubled clubs. People as will know, as I mentioned in the introduction, that you've been a director at both Sunderland and Charlton, took over both those clubs when they were financially troubled in the third tier of English football. I note that Sunderland are now second in the Premier League, just 7 years, I think, after you took over them. Charlton are sixth in the Championship 3 years after you went there. So you can claim some kudos for that. You've got experience of turning around clubs in a state of financial disrepair. And although I understand that Wednesday fans will be absolutely delighted that Chansiri is gone, of course, administration comes with a 12-point hit in the league, so makes relegation extremely difficult to avoid. And the club will need to be built back up again from a position of great weakness, I'd suggest.
Yes, Adrian. Now, you can be, supporters of Wednesday can be simultaneously happy that they've been released from almost the sort of the hostage situation that they were in under Dejphon Chansiri's ownership, where he clearly needed to go but was refusing to go. A little bit like the wonderfully named Dai Yong at Reading this time last year, but rather like with Reading. I wouldn't say be careful what you wish for, because clearly it is a good thing when an owner who's reached the end of the road is ejected out of the situation that he's been clinging on to. But there can be a little bit of an element of the frying pan into the fire unless you're careful, or unless you're lucky or unlucky, whatever it might be. Because to a degree, at least, the hard work starts now or very soon, right? So what does being in administration, let's first of all deal with the administration element of it, right? What does being in administration look like? Well, being in administration is in itself often a difficult time inside the club, because the reason why you've gone into administration normally is because the previous owners run out of money. What that then means is that when the administrator comes in, the administrator is then running the club without much money. And of course, the administrator does not have his own money to spend, and therefore he has to drag in cash and revenue from wherever he can just to keep the club ticking over whilst he goes through the process of selling the club. So that's why the big call went out from the administrator and, in fact, from the Sheffield Wednesday fan groups to fans saying, we all need to turn up now. We need to turn up. We need to spend money in the stadium. We need to spend money in the shop. I saw that £150,000 worth of kit was bought in the club shop yesterday. Now, that's 150,000 straight on the bottom line, because all of that stock has already been bought by the club, right? So that is clear extra revenue, which the administrator will now have to run the club. And if you look at the crowd yesterday, about 28,000. We noted on a previous podcast that there are 18,000 season ticket holders. So that extra 10,000 of tickets sold yesterday at an average ticket price of, let's say, 25 to £30, that's an extra 250, 300,000 straight on the bottom line. Then you've got the food and beverage inside the stadium, etc. So after the game yesterday against my home club, Oxford United, which Oxford, from my perspective, obviously happily won. The administrator will have seen, something like 500,000 quid pouring in to the club, which will help him now to pay off a few of the bills, to clear, to help to pay the wage bill. Probably he'll be in discussions with the Football League about forwarding some of the TV payments from the next few months and making sure that they've got enough cash coming in to see them through the months of November and December. Because it's going to take at least that long for the administrator to sell the club. Because at the same time, of course, the football regulator has started with a mandate to be very tough on the type of owners who are allowed in. So the old days of the administrator coming into a club and the first guy that comes along and says, right, I'm willing to pay X or Y, the administrator says, that's great. As long as you can pay my fee as well, I'm happy. We're all fine here. And the Football League signing it off quickly, as has happened in the past. This is going to be harder. This is going to be more difficult. The regulator would already have spoken to the administrator and would have told him, look, I fully appreciate that we need to get the club sold and sold reasonably quickly, but I am not going to sign off on having another cowboy owner. They're going to need to come up to scrutiny. They need to stand scrutiny according to the mandate that the football regulator has. So these next 2 months are going to be really, really interesting. Anyhow, putting that to one side, when the new owner does start, whoever that might be, and the new executive team, particularly the new executive team appointed by the new owner starts, what situation do you find? Well, in some ways, there are certain things which are common to all troubled clubs in these situations, and there are certain things which are particular to the clubs in question, right? So let's start off with the things that are particular to the clubs in question. What we inherited at Sunderland was a club that was sinking under the weight of its own totally unsustainable cost base. Because they'd been relegated in quick succession from the Premier League to League One in the space of, a year or two, there were still remnants of a Premier League cost base in place. So you still had players on salaries that had been Premier League salaries with a small discount for relegation to the Championship and no discount for relegation from the Championship to League One. So we had numerous players in League One who were on £2.5 to £3 million a year in a league where many of the clubs we were competing against only spent 3 or 4 million on their entire first team squad. You also had extraordinary, we had 3 chauffeurs and all these types of things that Premier League clubs have, and a Cat 1 academy and a professional women's team and all these types of things that Premier League clubs have. And yet you've got League One revenues, very good League One revenues, of course, in Sunderland's case and in Sheffield Wednesday's case, as will be the case, but still nowhere near enough once the TV money's been ripped away, nowhere near enough to sustain the type of cost base that Sunderland had. This is not going to be a problem for Sheffield Wednesday because the nature of Chansiri's last 18 months in charge, when he couldn't afford to pay any bills, is that the cost base has basically cratered as people left. So as members of staff left and as players handed in their notice and left and weren't replaced or were replaced with very, very cheap options, the cost base of Sheffield Wednesday is actually now in a good place. So whoever comes in there is going to have that advantage. However, here's the catch. You then have to look under the bonnet, just like a mechanic would look under the bonnet of a car. And you have to understand how that engine should look. And then you have to be able to look at how it actually is. And then you have to be able to understand, as an executive, how to rewire the whole system to get it back up in order again. And meanwhile, was the case at Sunderland, I think at Sheffield Wednesday it's going to be a bit more realistic. You've got fans screaming, sign players, sign players, sign players. But actually, because you know more about the way in which the whole thing works than them, that it's not really about that. It's about all the other systems that are in place. What's your recruitment system looking like? What is your physical performance department looking like? What are the facilities at the training ground looking like? What is the sort of the backroom operation, which actually organises the logistics for everything looking at? Because at a club like Wednesday, all of that would have been hollowed out. And they'll be basically running on empty. There'll be bodge jobs everywhere, bodge jobs in the stadium, bodge jobs at the training ground, bodge jobs in terms of people doing 2 or 3 different jobs and not really able to do any of them in exactly the right way. So my hope and my prayer for Sheffield Wednesday is that they land in the lap of an owner / an executive team, or an owner who appoints an executive team who actually understand the task at hand. It is not as simple as just saying, sign lots of players. It really, really, really isn't, right? To get from where Sunderland were 6-7 years ago to being second in the Premier League now required 2 years of fundamental cultural turnaround. The whole thing had to be rebooted and rewired. And that is a tough process because you're not being thanked for it as you go along, either internally or externally, right? All the things you're doing, which do need to be done, are not things which straight away end up with glorious victories on the pitch. That happens in year 3, 4, 5, 6 on an increasing basis. Charlton, on the other hand, Charlton was in a slightly different situation. Charlton did not have quite such a horrific cost base to deal with, but it had been run in a eccentric way for a number of years by various different owners, landing in the previous owner to us, whose son was the director of football and whose girlfriend was running chunks of the business operation and all of these types of things. So effectively, whilst the fundamentals of the club weren't so bad, the professionalism of the entire enterprise has fallen into disrepair, and the culture therefore had suffered as a result. So that was there are similarities and there are differences, but the main thing is you need people in charge who actually know what they are doing, and that's the challenge. If I look at Reading right now, just finish on this thought, right? So in whenever it was, March, April, when De Jong was booted out and Reading fans were triumphant, so happy, right? Bright new future for Reading. And then the new owner comes in. He appoints the guy who was his left back at his previous club, Wycombe Wanderers, as his chief executive. And then 6 months later, Reading fans are starting to ask, what's the plan? Where are we going? We're either in or close to the relegation zone. We're actually doing worse now than we were previously. And are the right things being done behind the scenes? Now, the answer is I don't know if the right things are being done behind the scenes. What I will say is it's quite hard to look at that Reading executive team and say that that's an executive team who look to have the capabilities to turn around the problems that are inside the engine of that car.
One thing I will say on behalf of Wednesday fans, they did stage pretty much a full boycott of their midweek game, I think, against Middlesbrough. And maybe that was the point which drove them to this point of administration. So it takes a lot for football supporters to actually boycott their own clubs. Wednesday fans did that, described by a Blackpool fan who did it in my book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, as the ultimate sacrifice by supporters. So I know how hard it is for fans to do that, but well done to Wednesday fans for really pressuring Chansiri. But
I should say that Wednesday fans have behaved absolutely immaculately in this entire situation. So what they did was, first of all, I think they were quite patient with Chansiri and sought dialogue with Chansiri in a pretty reasonable way. The supporters group saying, look, we would like to meet with you. We'd like to understand what you're doing. We'd like to understand what the plans are, etc., etc. When that got pushed back on, they moved into a sort of, more in sorrow than in anger type of protest situation. Then when that didn't work, they stepped it up a little bit further. And then when that didn't work, they stepped it up a little bit further. But at every single point, they were offering off-ramps to Chansiri, right? They were constantly saying to him, come on, we're being reasonable here. We're trying to help, right? They were never really getting themselves into that place that some club supporters get into where, the rest of the world looks at you and go, yeah, you're not really helping yourself here. And then what happens the moment they go into administration? They then turn up in force. Almost 30,000 of them turn up in force. Like, what a club. What a great club. And that is a fan base. I don't say this lightly because I don't say it of all fan bases. That is a fan base that now deserves to have a great ownership.
One final thought on Wednesday, though, Charlie. They've gone into administration. That means they cannot pay all of their debts. There are football clubs who are owed money. HMRC, which is the inland revenue, which is ultimately all of us, the great British taxpayer, has not been paid money we are owed. So what's going to happen to that money? Effectively, is the taxpayer going to subsidise the continued survival of Sheffield Wednesday? No?
No. So what's going to happen is this under league rules. So the condition of the new ownership will be as follows. The first entity to be paid will be HMRC, right? So when the deal is agreed with the administrator and there's an offer that comes in, the first creditor is HMRC. The second creditor is the administrator himself, right? So I believe that there are debts of 2 to 3 million to HMRC, and there will be a fee of 1 to 1.5 million for the administrator. So the first 3 or 4 million will go to that before a penny gets paid to anybody else, staff, Chansiri, whatever it might be. Those two entities have to get paid out for the club to continue in its existence. There are then football debts to clubs in there, I believe. Another 1 or 2 million on former transfer fees and this type of stuff. Takes you up to 5 million, 6 million, that type of thing. Then there are, so those have to be cleared and the players have to be paid. Without that being done, the club would fold. The good news is that the total sum of all those debts is significantly less than the value of the club. So they will get paid because somebody will see that if all I have to do is pay off all those debts, then I'd still be getting Sheffield Wednesday for 6-7 million quid. Then you've got the stadium, which is a separate company, but also in administration, right? So there's a creditor against the stadium. A deal will have to be done with him, but it's not compulsory that he gets paid out in full. Now, the rule for other debts is that under Football League rules, they have to be paid a minimum of 25 pence in the pound, right? So then there'll be an arm wrestle. because the administrator is meant to act on behalf of all the creditors, primarily, right? So there'll be an arm wrestle about how much gets paid to both local tradespeople and to the guy who's got debt secured against the stadium who lent it to Chansiri in the first place. That's the next bit. Then the bit after that, and the bit which is a little bit thorny, is of course, in common with a lot of club owners, Chansiri, when he had put money into the club, had put it in as debt, right? So there is also 50 million quid owed to Chansiri. Now, he's a long way down the pecking order, right? But if legally, if it were the case that somebody had to pay out 25% of Chansiri's debt, then that would make the club unsaleable, because that would be an additional 12 to 13 million on top of all the other things that we've just been talking about. And that would then end up with the club, the total amount you need to pay would be more than Sheffield Wednesday would be worth in League One. So my guess is that the administrator is going to be making the argument that the debt to Chansiri is not really the debt that the Football League envisages when it says that you have to pay 25 pence in the pound on debt, right? That, my guess is the administrator is going to say that's not really debt. That was him funding the club in a way that he thought was tax efficient. So there'll be a bit of an arm wrestle around over that. But my anticipation is that the real challenge here is not going to be getting enough money in to pay off the creditors. The real challenge is going to be finding a buyer quickly enough who passes muster with the regulator, right?
And I know that the Owls Trust, Sheffield Wednesday supporters have said that they have got a plan in place should no owner be found. But it does mean, very briefly, Charlie, because I do want to move on to Celtic, but it does mean if you're a local pie maker, for example, and I use that example just at random, you could end up getting only a quarter of the money that you're owed, or a local printer, something like that. Local tradesperson, you could end up copping a pretty rough deal out of it.
It's possible. I think in many of these tradespeople's sort of situation, the administrator will need them to keep on supplying the club during the administration. And one of the conditions that those local tradespeople might say is, okay, fine, I will keep on supplying my pies, but you're going to have to pay me up for what I've supplied to date. So there'll be discussions. That's what the administrator's job is. That's what their expertise is in, frankly, is doing those types of deals. So I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but it is eminently doable. Just hope that at the end of it, Wednesday ends up where it needs to end up. Because it's been with Chansiri now, 11 years, something like that. It now needs to have, for the next 5 years, a solid, respectable, clever plan with people who know how to do it in place to enable the club to get properly back on its feet. It really could do without having another owner who doesn't know what they're doing.